He's the chairman of the NBA-SBL Employment, Labor and Industrial Relations Committee, and he will be speaking to the panelists today. NBA-SBL and business. This is a collaboration between the NBA-SBL, and it will feature a series of webinars and podcasts in the following months. And this is the first of a long series of podcasts and webinars. And today we'll be talking about critical issues in industrial relations, employment, and labor. And I'm hoping that we can all take a little bit of, we'll all learn a bit from here, or we'll take a lot, depending on how the conversations go today. It's going to be a Q&A session. And I'm sure by the time we've listened to the panelists, there'll be a lot to take away from here. I look forward to hearing the panelists speak. I would like to welcome them to Lola, Bina, Ayodeji, and everyone else who is here. We'll begin the session right now with Ose taking the floor. Ose, over to you.
Thank you very much, Theodora. And let me say welcome to everyone once again. Like Theodora mentioned, this is a collaboration between the Employment Industrial Relations Committee of the SBL and Business Day, Legal Business. Again, let me just reiterate that the role of the Employment Industrial Relations Committee is one, to inform, educate, and where possible, influence government policy and decisions. And so we decided, considering the challenges that we face at this point, we thought this was a good platform to carry out our activities at the same time, educate, inform, and see if we can also push the agenda about policy changes. So without taking much of your time, I will go into the business of today, which typically is to talk about one of the outcomes of the pandemic, which we all know is currently ravaging the world. As we speak, as a result of the total lockdown across many countries, the International Labour Organization projects that there will be about 25 million jobs lost. Coincidentally, the whole pandemic has thrown up a new vista of work. So organizations have now had to either find a way to work remotely or actually shut down. So the concept of remote working has now been thrown to the fore. And interestingly, as far back as 1996, the ILO had come up with a recommendation on home working. And by 2002, the EU developed a framework agreement for teleworking. Then fast forward to 2010, the United States passed the Federal Enhancement Teleworking Agreement. So in this climate, there's a definite framework. And then if we look at the figures today, the numbers are really staggering. A recent research by Microsoft, which I believe was published last week, actually shows that in the first week of March, the minutes per meeting a day for their Microsoft team, a meeting app, was about 90 million meeting minutes per day. But by the first week of April, it had gone to 2.7 billion meeting minutes per day. Those figures are staggering. It just shows that there's been a gradual and almost sudden move from physical work to remote working. Now, Morgan Chase, Barclays Bank, and Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, and Morgan Stanley recently, between three of them, just to point out, they take up more than 10 million square meters of office space in Manhattan, New York. And they came out to say, look, we do not think that there's a need to spend as much money on office space. And typically we might now think about, since this has worked well, we might actually think about people working more from home than really coming back to the physical office. And then this morning on Bloomberg, I've overheard Warren Buffett saying that really, in all honesty, he doesn't think that the work will return to the way it used to be. And again, if you think about it, because this has changed the way we work and the way we live and socialize, for health reasons, it might really not be possible for everybody to come back to the workspace again. However, if you put it in context, These countries, like I mentioned earlier, have a framework. And this is what we struggle with in Nigeria. So today, we have a panelist who would discuss this within the context of the practicality and realities of remote working in Nigeria. So I have is the team lead, Workforce Advisory, Ernst & Young West Africa. I have Ayode Ajibola, who used to work with Microsoft and currently is the HR director of Guinness, part of the Dago Group. And I have with me also Bina Idinije, who is the Senior Counsel, Employment and Industrial Relations, GE. And they will be drilling down this concept within the context of the practicalities and realities in Nigeria. So that was just to set the tone for this conversation. But let me just say that the way we try to run this is to have 2 sets of questions for each panelist. And the first one will go for 5 minutes. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to drill down the topic or the question. And then the next round will be for another 5 minutes, so that we'll have enough time to take on the questions. And if we see half time after that, we'll go back to some areas that we not think that we have appropriately covered. I hope this kind of puts, how would I put it, some signposts to the conversation we're going to have. So without wasting much time, let me start with Lola. So Lola, here is it. You are in consulting. So I believe you would have consulted for clients around issues on remote working. And again, let me just say this again, let me just drop this here. 2 years ago, we had a conference and Lola was the keynote speaker on that conference, one of the keynote speakers, and she talked about the digital workforce and how to manage the millennials who are driving the narrative as to remote working. And part of what she said that day was by the year 2025, most people will probably work from home or from remote places with concepts like digital nomads and digital natives and all that. But fast forward now, your prediction has been pushed backward by almost 5 years. And what you predicted will happen in 5 years' time is actually happening now. So in reality, the point here is, what kind of context of Nigeria and the framework that we have? We need to really understand, if you can drill it down to us, what is remote working? What does it entail? What are the various genres of remote working? And what are the practical issues you've had to deal with in advising clients about remote working?
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and I trust we're all keeping safe. First, just to thank Nigerian Bar Association and then Business Day for the honor of the invitation. Just before I go in, just a quick comment. I think also these days we advise our clients, not necessarily consult, because that can look like you're just talking, and so we work with them to see what works. So I think back to the subject at hand, remote working. I think looking at what's happened in the last 2 months or so, in Nigeria, we really didn't have the choice as to whether or not to get on board. Reality happened, and all of a sudden, we had to comply, really, because businesses had to continue. We had to keep employees safe. So I think without getting too prescriptive, I'd just like to simplify the definition a bit. So generally, remote working would be work that doesn't happen in your typical or usual environment, which would be your desk at work. And so we've seen that term become so popular in the last few months, but it's actually been around because you've got many terms that are related to that subject. So for example, a few years ago, when diversity became a hot topic, we were talking a lot about telecommuting, teleworking, flexi timing. So they're all variants of remote work, which is essentially saying you can do work outside of your usual workspace. Now, for flexible working, which is slightly different, this means that you determine your work hours, of course, working with your employer. So what you've seen, for example, with remote working is, I don't know if that's been the experience for the other panelists, but really, it's like you're working around the clock. So it's no longer 9 to 5. You could have meetings very early. Someone in Australia wants to have a conversation. So within the confines of remote working, we now see ourselves doing some type of flexi timing as well. Then there's telecommuting, which means that, so as the word commute would suggest, it means you're not traveling into work, but you're doing it remotely from somewhere else. So again, it's still another form of remote working. But essentially, remote working would be anything that allows you work from anywhere, such that you're able to connect with your critical stakeholders on digital platforms. And that word digital is very specific because sometimes we interchange digital with internet, but internet is just one of the platforms by which you get a digital experience. So when you're talking about connection with your stakeholders via a digital platform, you normally will be referring to the acronym SMART, so which means you can connect socially, you can do it mobile, you can use some form of data to drive the conversation, and then obviously we're talking about clouds these days. So that's what you mean by the digital experience. So anything that allows you work, but using not your typical work office location and connecting via all or either of those platforms I described. So I just really want to talk about what has happened to us in Nigeria in relation to remote working. So remote working, again, has evolved as one of the business survival strategies. So the terminology we'd use really would be disaster planning or business continuity. And one word that has come up a lot in the last 3 weeks is the term resilience. And resilience generally just means the ability of an organization to remain sustainable in the face of threats, whether biological or cyber, as we see these days. So again, remote working has emerged as one of the ways to help organizations activate their business continuity plan. For example, where I work, it's a global firm, but even ahead of the decision to now shut down or lockdowns, we decided to test our business continuity platform. So we actually had a day where all our offices in Africa shut down just to see whether we could still work with our clients, we could still access valuable information, data, just to test our preparedness. So remote working is one of the ways to do that. So should the business have an issue today, how quickly are we able to move on? How quickly are we able to continue? So resiliency and remote working are very, very closely related. And more than ever before, it's here to stay. So I'll just latch on to what you said quickly about, look, yes, 2 years ago, I did say it was 2025. But as you all know, with disruption, some forces you can control, some you cannot control. So what's happened is in Nigeria before, we used to say, oh, yes, remote working works in Europe, but it won't work here because we don't trust each other. People will not work. But we see all of that has changed. So generally, remote working would not only be one good way to activate your business continuity plan, it's also a good way to begin to project a strong employer value proposition. Trust is now the currency for modern business, but it also puts a lot of pressure on how we have structured work currently. So I'll just take a step back and allow the other panelists contribute. Thanks, Ose.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lola. JG, this is for you. And I wanted Lola to look at it from what's done. You are the HR director of Guinness, and I want you to look at it again from an employer-employee relationship point of view. What would you advise in your organization? How does it work? Do you guys have a remote working framework in place in your organization? What are the challenges, and what would be your advice as to implementing this?
Okay, thanks, Ose, and thank you for the honor to be speaking on this panel today with my fellow panelists. So there are lots of implications that, have come about as a result of the current situation we find ourselves. And one of the key things that has come to light as a result of this current situation is how important it is for a company to be agile, to be able to adapt quickly, and to be able to innovate as well. So looking at employer-employee implications when it comes to remote workings, there are quite a few, and I'll just narrow down on some. So if you think about it, first of all, from a legal contractual standpoint, there's the implication on the contractual obligations and the employer review of policies and financial costs. And what I mean by that is this, that right now, as a result of, remote working and the need for adaptability, companies need to look at contract, terms to make them more relevant to remote working. So for example, I've worked in a few companies where you have resumption times, closing times, provision for, location, where you're going to be located, who you're going to be, report to, KPIs that are dependent on face-to-face intervention, for example, and then the types of leaves, allowances, and benefits. So in this age of remote working, how relevant is your are some of the allowances it is that you have, how relevant are some of the benefits, like a canteen, for example. So we need to have a more flexible language in our employment contracts. And then with respect to policies in the company, it's also time to review policies to accommodate remote working. And then there's the financial implication as well, positive and negative. So there was a point you raised also about, in the near future, investing less in office space, for example, because remote working would become or is the new norm. Because I think one thing that has been brought to the fore, even in, from what I've experienced where I am, and generally, is that companies that hitherto did not think it was possible for people to work from home and be productive from home have been forced to realize that it's a very, it's a serious possibility. And I see a situation where they would actually embrace that as a preferred option, especially for employees, than coming into the office, Monday to Friday every day. So financially, in terms of implications, on the flip side, where you have companies that, have employees that earn overtime, at what point does overtime kick in? Since we're working around the clock, since there's no commute time, Lola also mentioned time zones as well. When does overtime kick in for those kind of employees? There's also infrastructure costs in terms of now companies would now have to, as a standard, provide tools and resources to work from home. So internet modems, allowances to support, generators and what have you, things that they didn't have to necessarily think about before. And then company policies generally, mandatory leave. So some companies as a strategy have had to look at ways to mandate employees to work, go on leave because they cannot work from home productively. But is that in your contract, right? So going forward, I see a situation where that becomes part of the standard clause in employee contracts. Workmen's compensation, for example, is another thing. How does it apply in our current situation? What happens if an employee is injured from home? Would you say that workmen's compensation will not apply because of the way it's structured currently, or do we have to look at the provisions of that policy to see how we can adapt it to remote working? There's also the issue of confidentiality of employer data and information and greater vulnerability to cybersecurity risks. So for example, in the office environment, there's typically a high and consistent standard of cybersecurity protection because that is regulated within the office, space. But at home now, with everybody being at home, employees are connecting to the company network with different devices, which may have a less secure file or, protection. And then, laptops, where there's situations where we leave our laptops unattended in the office. Okay, worst case, your colleague gets to take a look at what you're working on, but at least that employee is bound by the same confidentiality terms that you are bound to as well. So there's that sense of confidentiality that is commonly shared. But at home, that's not the case. Conference calls, for example, you're in a conference room in the office or at your desk, discussing confidential things that pertain to the company. But now there's the audience of strangers, especially where the employee does not have a secluded space at home to work from home. We also need to look at, we'll also be looking at, work methods and tools. So like I said before, providing that infrastructure as standard work tools. And it also means not everybody can work from home. So what do you do with those employees? Do you channel them to other parts of the business? Do you have the flexibility to channel them to other parts of the business where they can be productive? Do you use this opportunity as a chance for employees to test their skills in other areas, which is what some companies are doing currently? And it's also a time for technology companies to continue to develop and improve on tools that support work from home arrangements. So if you look at the popularity of Zoom, for example, versus Microsoft Teams, one would argue and say that, Teams security-wise functionality is much better, but with Zoom, there's that flexibility of just plug and play. You log in or you sign in, you get a link, you're good to go. So that would be, I see a growth in that space in terms of supporting productivity from home. It's also the implications of employee appraisals and performance in terms of KPIs. So what do our KPIs look like? And are they based on a face-to-face interaction? So if I think about my sales teams, for example, do I have KPIs that are dependent on face-to-face interactions with customers or with partners? How do I need to adapt that to redefine what my KPI should look like for my employees so that we can adequately measure productivities? And of course, employee engagement, and I'll just take that as one of my last points to give room for the other speakers. In this era of remote working, it becomes even more critical because of the psychological effects of working from home. So, on conference calls, everybody tries to be upbeat. They're putting in, trying to sound engaged, critical, but it takes a lot of toll to be able to work from home because you're not able to compartmentalize your life like you could when you were in the office. Especially if I think about people working in cramped spaces that cannot create a secluded or separate space to work, they have to manage that, with taking care of children, with tending the home and what have you. And it's really a lot to deal with. So it's a really critical time for employers to have, whether it's helplines, employee assistance programs, if they didn't have that before, counseling, and your good old fashioned checking in. So employers, through the managers, calling employees, how are you doing one-on-one? What are the things that you're really going through? How can I help? That connection becomes even more critical. And then last but not least, there's the privacy of employees. In a typical office space, my family life is my family life. I can keep that separate, but that's not the case today. It's a funny where Mother's Day video that Microsoft created on Mother's Day. And it showed, different women, conference calls. One had a child brushing her hair at that point in time. One had a, playful 9-year-old son that was kept on pulling and tugging at her chair. And these are probably not necessarily aspects of one's life that you'd want to share with your colleagues, but that has changed as we embrace the new normal. So I'll just leave that there so that the other speakers can continue.
Thank you very much, Gigi. Thank you very much. Yes, just to add to it, what you said about checking in and I read about recently and it made a lot of sense to me. So thank you for in your role, in your role as employment and industrial relations. You straddle over 20 countries in the sub-Saharan region. So you're more or less most times working remotely. So what are the legal implications that you've experienced? What are the legal issues that have come out of this kind of work situation that you've?
Hi, Ose. I think your line is not very clear. So but I think I got your question. Your question is just given the nature of my role and the fact that I work across multiple countries, there's a higher tendency that I get to work remotely. And so what are the legal implications that remote work brings for a role like mine? So I believe I've rephrased your question correctly, but if I haven't, please interject because I couldn't quite hear you well.
You have, Lola. You have, Bina. Thank you very much.
All right, perfect. Okay, so I just wanted to start by saying that, about 2 weeks ago, I attended a webinar, I was a panelist on a webinar on remote courts and online justice systems. And there was something striking that one of the speakers there said, and he basically asked the question around, is the court a place or a service? Which I thought was very striking. And so, in thinking about this remote work and what's happening today, I was asking myself, is work a place or a service? And I think the answer to that would be, it could be both and it could be just one. So in my case, really, the work that I do is similar to what law firms do, except I'm an in-house counsel. So I sit in an advisory capacity and I advise my client group to navigate employment risk. So if I look at it in that way, in my role, I don't need to be in a particular office. So a law firm, for example, would be in their office and advise companies. They don't need to physically sit with you. They don't need physical proximity to the client. And in a lot of ways, that's how my role is. So I would say that for somebody like me, yes, I would say remote work works for me perfectly. And even prior to the COVID intervention, I would work maybe 2 days remotely in a week. So it's something that I had been used to. sometimes I work a whole week remotely. I was quite flexible around whether I came into the office or not, because I didn't really physically need to be in my office to execute. But I do know, and I'm cognizant of the fact that there are several jobs, even with the COVID situation, that will not be able to be carried out remotely, because by nature of those jobs, they need to be done in person. Examples would be maybe jobs that have to do with operating machinery, which cannot be brought into your house. Jobs in the hospital, for example, where you need to interact with people, rig workers, for example, as well. So there are and there will continue to be jobs that will definitely not be able to be done remotely, and we need to just be mindful of that. Having said that, I think in terms of what are the potential legal issues that I see, I think it's more practical. There are legal issues, but also practical issues, a lot of which Deji has touched on a lot. Like, you were quite exhaustive in your answer, Deji, so I wouldn't go over all of those points as well. But I think definitely it's important to mention the fact that there are contractual implications. Right now, they may not necessarily be, because right now it's a force majeure situation and everyone has to comply. But if you're thinking about going on a full throttle, permanent remote work arrangement with maybe your entire population or a group of your population, you probably want to look at your contract and revisit that, just like Deji said, and think about, most contracts would have the work location indicated. You want to then revisit that and rephrase where that location might be. In some cases, you might say you would work from home. In some cases, I've seen contracts that say you don't have a particular work location, and then you can work from the client's place or from X place or from the home. So there needs to be a relook at how we begin to phrase employment contracts going forward and the implications of that. Company policies will be extremely important as well. What's doable, what's not doable. Right now, we are all forced to stay at home. Some of it is by decree and law, so we don't have a choice. But going forward, where companies are choosing by choice to make this a new arrangement, they need to think about the rules that will apply, the rules of engagement regarding remote working. And so policies will be very important to be in place if they aren't already. And then the other thing would be government legislation. We talked about the EU having a framework on teleworking, which I know that even in Africa, I know that Mauritius has a law. I think it's called the Employment Rights Working from Home Regulation 2019. So it's fairly recent, but it's a very robust law around what the legal framework is around working from home. So I think that in our Nigerian case, I would not hold my breath in terms of looking for such a legislation, given the fact that we have not, how long it's taken to even try to modernize our own labor act. So I would say that in that sense, we would have to lean into the contractual, the contract between the employee and the employer to govern the relationship around remote working. I think that would be more contractual rather than statutory solution. So I also wanted to touch on some practical examples of issues that would come up with remote working. Like I said, in addition to a lot of the things that Deji had pointed out, there is the fact that we'll have some novel issues to deal with. Like if an employee, let's say an employee defaults in their rent payment, for example, and they're evicted by their landlord, to what extent will an employer be responsible for ensuring that the employee secures an apartment so that they can continue to work? Let's say, for example, like today, like not all companies pay housing allowance. Some people pay, some people don't. Would it be in the future a mandatory requirement for companies to begin to pay housing allowance if you're going to expect employees to work from home? Let's say you have a domestic force majeure situation where it's a rainy season, so let's use that example. It's raining and your house gets flooded. Employer gets involved, right? Because now you're working from home. And so these are new things that employers will begin to think about as they put policies in place, as they think about getting people to work full stream from home. It's going to be a whole new dynamic, a whole new world, and there's going to be a blurring of the lines of personal space and workspace. It already is with all those of us that are working from home right now. And once it becomes the norm, then employers would then need to take on more liability than they may otherwise be obligated to do. And that in that situation, there is more legal risk that attend to those issues that they might not even be thinking about right now. I think the other thing I would say is the fact that employers still have an obligation to honor the employee's entitlement to leave. So the fact that somebody's working from home does not mean that they can no longer go on leave. I recently learned that there was a company during this lockdown period that told their employees that due to the lockdown, we consider that entire period as leave. And someone reached out to me to say, hey, Bina, what do you think about this? You know, is this something, was this legal? What are the employees' rights? And, you know, I didn't have all the information, but what I said is, it's not a hard and fast rule, so it depends. Were the employees working from home while during the lockdown? Because if they were working, then you can't say that that was leave because the operational world is working. But if they were prevented from working from home and they had to stay at home and they were not adding any value to their employer, then perhaps that's something that the employer, that was a reasonable action that the employer took. And so what I'm trying to say is, just because somebody's working from home doesn't do away with their entitlement to sick leave, doesn't do away with their entitlement to their normal annual leave. And then I would say lastly, the fact that people are working from home, I think it was Lola who mentioned the fact that there's no longer any boundaries with respect to the working time. There's no longer a pure black and white 9 to 5 timeline for work. And so there's two things, there's a pro and there's a con to this. The pro to the employer is that the employee is really reachable and all, but the employee risks, you know, mental and physical burnout, which could impact their own health as well. And so you find people sometimes working through the night. Some people are saying I had to respond to my boss at 12 midnight. You know, it's just kind of like, where do you draw the line? And so I know that in France, for example, because of this particular type of issue, they had to enact a law that is famously referred to as the right to disconnect law, but it's actually a law called, I think, the El Khomri law, which addresses working hours and the fact that employee, just kind of like putting rules in place around what employers can and cannot do with respect to reaching employees during who work remotely, and making sure that they respect the boundaries of working hours. So a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. I think I'll just stop there for now and we'll continue the conversation. But there's really, what I would say is, don't just think remote work is something that's as simple as just putting a policy in place. You need to think deeply as an employer about what the implications are and be ready to shoulder much more responsibility than you normally would be comfortable doing.
Thank you very much, Bina. That was quite exhaustive. I'll just say we're running short of time. So this next round, we'll just do 3 minutes each so we can take on some questions, because I've got lots of questions here, quite interesting questions to you. When we really talk about remote working, most times what comes to mind is a structured organization in the private sector. What about the informal sector? Because if you think about it, a whole lot of organizations in Nigeria, a whole lot of commerce happens in the informal sector in Nigeria. Is there anything like remote working in the informal sector? And apart from that, for an organization, is there a need to do a needs assessment prior to implementation of a remote working plan?
So thanks. I think in relation to informal sector and latching on to what the other panelists have said, when it comes to implementing remote work, it's actually never a black and white, even though, like I said earlier on, that it's here to stay because we have no choice. But again, the nature of work you do would really determine whether or not it's feasible. So for example, if I'm a service that has to be present, then it has to be done. But however, when you look at social distancing rules and the limit on number of persons in public spaces, it really just means that whether informal or informal, you've got to take a look at what works. But what I always say to people is, I think if we've not learned anything from the recent happenings, it's the fact that there's really no sector or service offering that is immune from disruption, either via, as we see from COVID, or even technology. So it's important to be able to look at what measures or aspects of your offering can be done remotely, because like I said, it is here to stay. And survey would show that about 75% of the global workforce, even though formal, is currently working remotely. So absolutely, that really speaks to the need for a needs assessment. So in the same organization, what works in your Western region, for example, might not work in your Southern office. So you definitely need to get a sense of what works. The first thing is to look at how the work is structured. Greater than ever, we would now need to focus on output and not activity. So that means you now be asking people to work on the basis of what they're able to produce or what the outcomes you can see and measure. there would also be huge leverage on technology because, and I think it's important not to think of technology as just being able to afford Zoom or whatever. These days, the average mobile phone can do WhatsApp. Once you have policies to guide how you work in the organization, you can still achieve some form of remote working with simple platforms. So that's where innovation as a critical tool becomes very, very necessary. You also then generally need to focus on the end result. What exactly are you trying to accomplish? So the needs assessment helps you prioritize your requirements, your needs. It even helps you identify how scalable your desire is. And then we say these days that data is the new oil. You have to be able to check. So it might just be that the current complement of your workforce is one such that they do not want the need. But if you have a huge millennial population, for example, then it probably makes sense to move your entire operations to remote. Of course, this is speaking of post a world where COVID is gone and then we're dealing with the realities. And then just to add finally that the experts are saying that, look, in about 5 years' time, only 43% of the available productive workforce will want full-time jobs. So that means that a lot of us now would need to focus on the reality that you'll be fishing in a water that is already scarce in terms of quality. So bearing in mind, we really do not have a choice as to whether or not to adopt remote working. Whether formal or informal, it's the way to go in my view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ola. That actually spoke to that. Deji, from a HR perspective, and I know this is a major issue in terms of our own peculiarity, in terms of our infrastructural deficit, technology-wise, in terms of our somewhat, will I say, discipline to work and attitude to work. How do you truly measure performance in terms of remote working? And I know recently there are productivity monitoring apps in the US and in other areas. Is this something you advise that we can use in Nigeria? So firstly, how do you measure productivity and performance when it comes to remote working? And would you advise the use of monitoring apps for that regard?
So in terms of monitoring performance, to say thanks for the question, there's no one size fits all. You have to look at your company, right, to determine what is the output it is that you require to be productive. So in other words, I think Bina raised the point about activity versus output that would now determine KPIs. So we need to look at our KPIs and what exactly do they capture? Do they capture activity or do they capture output? And I think going forward from a productivity standpoint, KPIs would have to be more output focused and more tangible and, easier to measure. And then when you talk about that notion of, because behind your question is still that notion that, once someone says they're working remotely, they're not working, right? They're resting, they're on holiday, they've gone to do their hair, nails, or whatever it is. So first of all, we need to dispel that notion because recent events have erased that notion or have to erase that notion in the minds of both employers and employees, right? So there has to be that.
So it looks like we've lost Deji briefly. Right. Okay, just back on.
Yeah, and you give them that leeway to deliver it, the way that works for them at the end of the day, And then, of course, with the investment in technology, you've talked about productivity apps and all that. But really, I think if you start from the basis of trust and making sure you as much as possible, hire people with the right kind of integrity, mindset, commitment, and attitude to work, right, then that solves your problem, at least part of it. Because you see, if you hire someone that is delinquent, they will find a way around the clocking apps. So if I use a big example where I go to some service-oriented organizations, or shops, and there's a fingerprint clocking system, and you would find that over time, the workers come in the morning, they come early, they put their fingerprint in, they've clocked in, and then they take off for a few hours in the course of the day, and then come back later. So there's always a way around these things if you truly do not have that integrity mindset. So I think one of the things companies would have to do long-term and painfully is to now take more time when it comes to the kind of people it is that they hire. What are they looking for? So it's not just I'm a salesperson, I increase sales by 40% where I was coming from, but what is the attitude to work, right? What is their, how do you have to dig deep to try and get a better sense of their commitment and attitude to work, and how, how seriously it is they take work generally. So that way you're more confident as an employer, giving them that leeway to deliver the objectives in the way it is that suits them. So I can't say yes or no in terms of using productivity apps, because you can have all the apps you want and people find a way around it, right? So I'd say before we make that investment, let's tidy up those other aspects first.
Thank you very much, Marie. Thanks a lot, and that speaks to that. And I'm for you, Bina. This is the question, right? So, Deji had mentioned the fact that each organization must look at what works for it, right? In terms of performance management, and in terms of the and I'm thinking about in terms of the performance monitoring apps. What do you think are the legal issues that might actually arise from if you then decide to go ahead and use a performance monitoring app? What kind of legal issues do you think organizations should be looking at if ever an organization decides to take that option?
Mm-hmm. So I think with respect to the monitoring apps, I think that generally employees need to manage their expectation of privacy from their employer, especially in the context of remote working. You need to lower it. You need to lower your expectation of privacy, because you are using probably the employer's work tool. You are being paid for the work that you are doing, and so the employer has a vested interest in ensuring that you are actually putting in the work. And so I think that whilst there may be potential privacy concerns, as long as there is a disclosure to the employee and they understand that the employers are monitoring them, and the request or the extent to which the monitoring is happening is reasonable, is of a reasonable degree, and is related to the work. Once those elements are there, I think employers will be largely within their rights to do what they are doing. I think obviously from a practical perspective, the things that Lola and Deji talked about around focusing on output as opposed to activity would be important in terms of the results that the employer is getting out of it. But remember that there are certain roles which may be tied to actually, in terms of compensation, for example, may be tied to how much time the employee puts in. And so it will be very important for the employer to be able to track that those hours were actually invested. So I think that from a legal perspective, it's important to make sure that there's disclosure, and depending on the degree of the monitoring, consent may be required. And if it is in that case, obtain that consent. I think that policies need to be in place in terms of the acceptable use of maybe information technology. Some companies have them. I think what employees should know generally is that whether you're aware or not, most employers are already monitoring your activity anyway. Whether it's your use of their systems or whatever, they are already monitoring it. But if they then need to monitor it to capture your productivity because you are no longer physically in the office where they can do like a physical supervision, I think they would largely, like I said, be within their rights to do so. The other thing I would say is employers need to think about, in terms of how they are doing the monitoring itself. It shouldn't be something that is happening under the radar. Just let employees know what tools you're using. Let them know exactly what you're checking for, what you're doing, and I think you'd be in a safe place in terms of that.
Okay. And one last one for everyone.
Running out of time.
Okay. So just one last one for everyone here, and I would like everyone to give this a bite for a minute or two, a minute each. If there's a needs assessment, and some certain rules have now been classed as those that can be done remotely, and the employee hasn't got the skill to carry out those tasks, considering that we do not have provisions currently in people's employment contracts asking them to work remotely, can the employer actually terminate them? So I'll start with you, Lola.
You know, I'm the only unlearned person on this panel, but I'll take a stab. since I'm the non-lawyer. But in any case, I think the first thing I want to stress, looking at this situation, is empathy and education. I think those are very important terms. The truth is, if you go by the standard contract, I can actually tell you that, oh, your services are no longer required. But like I say to my clients and associates, it's important to bear in mind that post-COVID, because we'll all survive, the companies that would actually thrive the most are the ones that treated their employees with empathy. Because the truth, no one has lived through this time, so there's no understanding of what to expect. I think there are many options before you decide that termination is the way to go. But engagement, education is key. Now, remember I did say you can't terminate, but the question is that the way to go? So one, you must have established clearly that there really is nowhere for you to fit. There are other options to take. So people are using furlough, which is really sending you on paid leave while you sort things out. People are putting severance packages in place, but in that case, you encourage the persons to resign so they can get benefits and what have you. Because if you terminate on the basis of, oh, there is no work, yes, I will take it in good faith, but bear in mind that industrial court is waiting. And there will be a lot of court cases on the back of people who don't do these things with empathy and armed with the right knowledge. So that would be my contribution, but I'd say it has to be the last resort, because you can't use performance as the reason why you're terminating. There are certain principles you must follow before you can terminate. You also cannot use an act of God in this case, or force majeure, because there's also the performance part of that as well as the reason. So that would be my contribution. But I think empathy should be one clear instance before you then say you're terminating.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you. I just talked to you 1 minute. Thank you. Deji, in a minute, please.
Yeah. Okay. So I liked the focus on empathy, but I'm sure, you know, a lot of business considerations, a lot of people here are asking that question from the basis of, look, I have a business, I have to survive, or it must remain productive and what have you. If I use an example from a company I know very well, what they've done in this period is basically to re-strategize and look at the efficiency of the business as a whole, right? So this is a time not to lay off people as a first resort, but to look at the inefficiencies in the parts of the business that we can now do away with. So for example, you know, they have a factory that is open, you know, 7 days a week. And now, you know, that factory has opened, you know, was running nonstop 7 days a week. Now they had to use this time to take a step back and say, look, from the volume standpoint, with the reduced demand, do we have to really be functioning 7 days a week? Can we do 5 days, which would reduce overtime, for example, which reduce running costs, overhead costs, what have you? Another thing they've taken the opportunity to do is to put people in work streams or rechannel them to other parts of the business where those skills can be used, right? So they've sold it to the employees in terms of, hey, you are not chasing away from your unit. It's a chance for you to pick up new skills or learn about other parts of the business you were interested in, but because of the restriction of your role, you are not able to do. So they've assigned people to other work streams apart from their, you know, direct places of work, so that and they're looking at different parts of the business that they want to work on as well. So for me, I would think that, look, layoffs should be the last resort, apart from the fear of the industrial court, which is very real. But there's also the empathy piece, because as you lay off people who, in your view, are not important or don't want, the ones who you do want, who you consider as critical, also looking at how you treat those employees and using that, you know, to form part of their decision as to whether to remain with you post-COVID or not. Yes, I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much. Please, Bina, can we take your view on this?
Also, can you repeat the question? I didn't quite get your question.
Okay, what I was saying is this: if following a needs assessment, certain roles were classed as those that can be performed remotely, and then the employee obviously does not have the capacity to work remotely, either because they're not computer literate or they are just stuck in their own world and they can't possibly work remotely. Is that enough reason for the employer to terminate a contract?
Okay, you know I'm a lawyer, so I'm probably not going to get as soft as Deji and Lola. Yeah, so I think if you do a needs assessment and based on your business strategy and your needs, those skill sets will no longer be required, maybe because based on your new strategy, most of the work will be handled remotely. And for whatever reason, some certain individuals do not have the technical capability or whatever it may be to execute from home. As an employer, your first, one of the main things you're in to do is in business is to be productive and profitable. And so if you continue to carry those people without having alternative solutions for them, like Deji and Lola of preferred, such as redirect them, figure out if there are certain work that needs to be done physically where they could be useful, and maybe try and see if they can take on those jobs. But if you have tried to exhaust all of those and there doesn't appear to be a solution, if it's a skill set issue, I think that a layoff would be top of mind, and an employer would be able to do that, because generally the ground for redundancy is actually, I think the word is self-explanatory. If that person can no longer contribute or add value, then that person automatically become redundant, and they cannot be reassigned to other skills to apply their skill sets in other areas of the business. Then the employer may be left with little or no choice. Now, if it is a case of, your question was really around skill sets, but I was just saying, in this scenario with COVID and everything that is going on, I think that definitely employers should not jump on the bandwagon of, I'm just going to lay people off. There are several other considerations that employers might consider. For example, rather than have people work 5 days a week, you can tell them, okay, let's work 3 days a week or 4 days a week, where I pay you a commensurate amount, so I'll pay you 60 or 80% as opposed to 100%, which, it's a win-win, because the employee doesn't completely lose their job, but then the employer is also managing their costs in line with the realities. Other considerations could be, if this is a temporary issue, and you figure that a few months down the line, things will probably return back to normal. One way to manage your costs could be to ask people to go on a leave of absence. So they still retain their jobs, they are on leave of absence until work is able to kick on again. And then lastly, I would say you can also consider potential salary reviews, so maybe a potential reduction in salary. All of these are just elements and things that people can consider in terms of keeping the workforce whole. I know a lot of people have been impacted, a lot of companies have been impacted by COVID and the resultant economic impact. And so what we're saying is, in line with the being empathetic, we want to make sure that employers think about creative, out-of-the-box solutions that are legal, that can also help to preserve the workforce. And then with all of these situations and all of these scenarios, I'm calling out leave of absence, salary reduction, part-time work. In Nigeria, you would need to get the consent of the employee, but I'd like to think that employees would be willing to negotiate and accept some of these terms as opposed to completely losing their jobs. So I know this is slightly outside the scope of what you're saying, but I'm just saying these are alternatives to redundancies if an employer has to make a choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Bina. And I have a couple of questions here, and I would like for us to quickly run through some of them. One that struck at me was a question that said, should people who work remotely in the same with equivalent rules for those who work physically? So if you work remotely and you have an equivalent comparator who goes to the office, should they actually earn the same thing? I will start with you, Lola.
So the question, if I go by my point of view to say work done not in your traditional office place is remote work, the answer is, if we're contributing equally, then the answer is yes. If anything else, there is a strong position to even suggest that there are immense cost benefit advantages to the employer. One, you can begin to scale down on your office space when you have people working remotely. Apart from the fact that coming out of COVID, I envisage a lot of people asking for mixed employment arrangement. It then gives you an opportunity to even run a hot desk. So you now no longer have to designate offices. People just come in, plug in wherever it is. Plus, you would also, in some instances, even now trial a bring your own device arrangement once your cybersecurity systems and policies are adequate. So I think generally it should be, again, the focus should be on the output. So long as I'm able to deliver, then there is really no need for the discrimination. So I'd even just speak from a personal point of view. I have now been working remotely. This is my second month actually, full-time. I'd say when we look at our stats, we've had more subscription on our trainings. We've had over a 60% subscription. So all the investments that were made on training, people are now doing it. I have had global trainings where I didn't have to travel. Before I would have had to consider tickets and all of that. I've had all my compliance trainings done. I have signed up more clients during this time. So if I do, for example, moving out of this, have my team members come to me to say the preference is to work from home, and some say they'd rather go into the office. The question is, are we meeting our KPIs? Are we delivering the targets? It should not matter where you're doing it from. And I believe personally, having tasted this experience and working in Lagos, I do not envisage a lot of people are in a hurry to go back. But of course, we must first overcome COVID. Thank you.
Thank you. And Deji, over to you, please. What's your take on this?
I mean, like I said before, underlying that question is the mindset that the person working remotely is not really working, or not working as hard as the person that, clocks into the office and is typing at their laptop. So I think, first of all, we need to dispel that notion, because COVID has shown us otherwise with this lockdown. And if I've also read studies and I've experienced it where people are actually putting in more hours now that they're at home, because during this lockdown than when they were in the office, because there's no commutes, right? So now, which is to Bina's point, where it's gotten as bad as the French government, for example, being one of the more pro-employee countries, having to put in legislation to rein that in, So productivity, I think, for me, should be the bottom line here, as opposed to whether people see you in the office or not. So in my last, 2 jobs, in GE and in Microsoft, nobody cares where you work out from, because it was typically a virtual team. It was really down to your outputs, your deliverables, your engagement with customers and with partners. And that should be the guiding principle here.
Thank you. Bida, I would like to have your take on this.
Yeah, I'll be very brief, because Lola and Deji have said it all, actually. So what I would say, I mean, for my personal experience, it's really, that question is really presupposing that somehow the four corners of the office add some value to the work that you are doing. And like I said before, in some cases it does. But if I'm working remotely and I'm able to work remotely, which, for example, if I give an example of my role, where I am here in Nigeria and I'm supporting several countries in Africa, I'm also supporting UK employment law. I cannot physically be in the UK and be in South Africa and be in Angola. So by virtue of that, I have to work remotely. And so to presuppose that because I am not physically in a place, I'm not able to execute, that is already a faulty premise. So I would say that's definitely faulty. It has nothing to do with whether you're physically in an office or not. And you should be paid just as much as your job requires you to be paid, regardless of the physical space that you're working from.
Okay. I think we'll have time for one more question. And I will take this, which says, if an employee, while working remotely in his house, gets injured, is it covered by the Employment Compensation Act? So I think I will spare you this one, and I'll let the lawyers deal with this. So, Deji, starting from you.
Okay. I would say that as a cop-out, I would say this is more of a question for Bina, who is the only practicing lawyer amongst us.
This is a setup. Well, so I haven't. I would respond to this having not read the Employment Compensation Act in detail, but I would say Employee Compensation Act in detail. What I would say that it depends on what the Act defines as workplace. I can almost bet that that Act was written without thinking about remote work, or that the workplace would be a place of work. But it all depends on how broadly or how narrowly that can be defined. But in any case, if it is the case that contractually the employer and the employee have agreed that the employee would work from home, I believe that if there is a dispute, any court would likely lean toward the fact that as long as the employer was aware that the work was being carried on at the house, and if it is proven that the injury was actually occurred in the course of the employee's duty, and if it is proven that the employer had an obligation based on the nature of the injury or the accident, had an obligation to have made the environment more safe, then perhaps the employee would have a case. So because I said that there's a blurring of the line between personal and workspace with the remote working environment. So if you refuse to, you had a shower and you left your door open and the water was overrunning and you refused to clean the floor and then you sleep, how is that the employer's problem? But then there's going to be some difficulty in really trying to prove this and showing the evidence and all of that. So it's a whole new complex and interesting world. But yes, I think we'll navigate it as we go forward.
Thank you. But just to chip in here, you mentioned the issue of working more from home. And I agree with you, because most research has shown that one of the biggest challenges with remote working is unplugging. So unplugging is a major challenge. Mental health and unplugging is two major issues with remote working.
Absolutely.
And on the issue of accident in the work at home, a committee reading of Section 5, 7, and 11 of the Employment Compensation Act actually, quite interestingly, defines workplace and course of work to be any place that the employer agrees for the employee to carry out his duties. So if you take that on, if the employer agrees that you should work remotely, then for all intents and purposes, that's your workplace. And that's where everything you guys have said here about the contractual framework changing becomes very relevant. So if it's in your contract that you can work remotely, and you're working remotely from home and there's an accident, then the employer is actually liable because it's in the course of work. So that was just my comments on that. I don't know.
I would say also that also we need to make sure that it is not the act of employee's negligence. So the employer might have some liability.
Absolutely. You see,
then obviously the nitty-gritty would.
Again, that is where the challenge comes from. Is it that the employer has to carry out a health and safety audit of the house of the employee to be sure that there are no wires lying around? So if the employee walks up to go and get a cup of coffee and it spills on him or her, is that in the course of work? So again, like you said, these are issues that we navigate as we come across them, because it's a novel thing that's happening. We've never been in this situation before, and I guess we will learn from this. And let me see if we have enough time to take one more question, because we seem to have a lot of them here.
I lost you for a second. Was that question for me?
Sorry?
I lost you for a second. Was that question for me?
No, I'm just saying, I'm just going to look at a question I want us to see if we can quickly just have a look at. Let's see. Okay. I think we've answered that, which was, would you consider it abandonment of duty if an employee is not skilled enough to work remotely? I think we've answered that already. So I would like to say thank you very much, and I would like to give everybody one minute to say one last few words so that we can conclude. So starting with Lola, one last word from you.
So I think it's just to encourage everyone. So like everything else that is new, it goes through some teething issues. I promote remote working. I think it's good for mental health, and I also mentioned the fact that there are cost-benefit advantages. I think this is a time for both employers and their employees to see the need to take care of each other. This is new for all of us, so we don't have all the answers. To the practitioners, I think HR practitioners now, it's very important to engage. This is one time where you cannot pretend to have all the answers. Speak to your legal colleagues. Also make sure across the industry you understand what is going on. But a huge dose of hope and positivity is important for this time. And then of course, we should maintain the rules around social distancing and all the general healthcare guidelines. And then really just to say thank you to Business Day and the Nigerian Bar Association, essentially for this platform. You can't really overemphasize the need for information and knowledge sharing during these times. Thank you.
Okay, Bida.
Yeah, also, I just want to say thank you to NBA-SBL and Business Day for driving this conversation. And I understand there are going to be a series of other conversations around this area. So I think it's extremely important. And from the participation, you can see that these are topical issues. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, same thing here. I'd also like to say thank you to the organizers for creating this platform, and glad that it's the first of many. And apart from what we talked about in terms of empathy, in terms of checking in on employees and having that one-to-one connection, especially at this time, for companies to be relevant for the future of work, I think there are two things they need to be very mindful of. One, investing in technology where they haven't done so before, they need to do that, and even more so now. And there's also the increased agility for change, and adaptability and innovation. So where possible, may have to deviate from what they've been used to producing or the ways it is that they've been used to working to be able to survive and be relevant in this new space.
Thank you very much, Deji. Thank you very much, Lola. Thank you very much, Bina, for coming. And I would like to say, before I hand you over to Theodora for the vote of thanks, I would like to say this is a series, and shortly for participants, we will circulate the timing and login details for the next webinar, which will be sometime in June next month. And I would like to thank you very much for all your questions. For the questions we've not taken, we would send it to the panelists for them to put in their thoughts on it, and then we will circulate it as FAQs to your emails which you registered with. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time, ladies, and Theodora, please, over to you for the vote of thanks.
Theodora is on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. I was just going to say that we got quite a lot of questions, over 44 questions, and I'm hoping that the panelists will have time or would find time to respond to some of them so that most of these questions will be answered. Our panelists, we can't thank you enough, Lola, Bina, and Deji. It was such a delight listening to you. We have heard everything that you have said, and I think for employers and employees, the key takeaway for me is that productivity is key, regardless of location. Remote working has come to stay, and we must take advantage of all the opportunities it presents. We must move ahead, of what the present situation is now, and begin to rebuild our businesses, grow our businesses, and then work effectively. Productivity for KPIs. I understand that it's output over everything else, and I hope we all heard this loud and clear and do all we can to take advantage. Thank you very much. Thank you, NBA-SBL. We hope that we will have more people sign up to the NBA-SBL Employment, Labor and Industrial Relations Committee. It's a good way to start to be part of these conversations. You can also look out for our YouTube channels, the Business Day YouTube channel, the Legal Business YouTube channel, and the NBA-SBL YouTube channels as well. These conversations, both in podcasts and webinar, will go on all of these platforms. Thank you for joining us today. We truly, truly appreciate you being here today. Thank you, Ose. Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you soon again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Law, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.